Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I'm the author of the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and Suspense Shorts and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, and I also write, speak, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage, and I discuss those topics with my expert guests on the Indie Author Podcast. And you can find out more about me and my work at mattydalrymple.com and at theindieauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors two questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And I am here today with MaryCatherine McDonald. Hey, MC, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm so good. Thank you so much for having me.
I am happy to have you here. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, MaryCatherine MC McDonald, PhD, is a research professor and life coach who specializes in the psychology of trauma, stress, and resilience. She's been researching, lecturing, and publishing on the neuroscience, psychology, and lived experience of trauma and stress since her PhD in 2009. She's passionate about destigmatizing trauma, stress, and mental health issues in general, as well as reframing our understanding of trauma in order to better understand and treat it. And her latest book is Unbroken: The Trauma Response is Never Wrong. And so I'm here today asking MC the two What I Learned questions. And we're going to start with, what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
The first thing, I think this is so important, and I haven't heard writers speak about this very often, is that all of the pieces of your path come together when you are writing a book like this one. And these pieces that may have seemed disconnected can come together, and it's such a gratifying thing because there are pieces in your life story that don't make sense at the time when they happen. But I think when you engage in the creative act of writing, those pieces just join together into a unified whole, even if they're not all part of your writing. And that was something totally unexpected about me writing this book in particular. So just to give you an idea of the layout of the book, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. So I bring in three different disciplines: neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, to think about and rethink mental health, and in particular, trauma. And so I'm also a life coach, and I've had my own life experience. And so all of these three pieces of my life came together in this book, which is composite client stories, neuroscience and tools, and then also my own story. And it felt at times in the writing very disconnected, just like it felt in my life. These pieces were disconnected, but then as it came together, there was this coherence that felt, like it was coming from almost somewhere else, that was really healing for me in my own, just looking on my own life story.
Was it the act of capturing it in words, or was it the act of organizing it? And do you think that that response would have been different if whether or not you were planning on sharing that writing with someone, or if you
Oh,
were just writing for yourself?
those are great questions. I think that there was this coherence, like I said, that came together, that I felt such an urgency to get this message out to as many people as possible. And that urgency really fueled the message in a way that if I had just been writing in a journal, I don't think that that would have cohered in that same way. I might have gotten stuck in victimhood mentality in certain places, but because I was so focused on getting the science out along with these stories, it sort of came together in this way that I think is totally unique. I've written in academic spaces before this. I have two other academic books, and I've written research papers. So in a lot of ways, the writing of this book felt like total freedom. Like I was doing this thing outside of academia, and that felt very exciting. But then again, like there was this urgency and the sort of lending coherence to these stories, which exists whether we recognize it or not, but sometimes it doesn't exist until we render the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a critical piece of trauma healing. One of the things that we know about traumatic memories is that they don't, our memories are kind of like file folders, and the file folder needs to have a narrative content, emotional import, and then a set of meaning tags in order for our brain to kind of put it away and recognize that the thing that happened is in the past and not in the present. And so trauma memories sort of explode the filing system because they don't conform to those rules, but the brain needs the memory files to conform. And so when we tell trauma stories, when we render them, even if we're adding in pieces that we don't know about or that may be a little bit foggy, we're sort of lending coherence where it wasn't there. We are doing something that is a critical part of healing, because every time we write about it, we are signaling to our brains that the thing that happened is in the past. And so instead of coming forward as something that is present, ever present in the form of symptoms, we can sort of render it into the past.
And when you were making that change from doing academic writing to this kind of writing, and I'll ask you to describe a little bit what this kind of writing is, I'd be curious to hear about what lessons from your academic writing you carried forward and what lessons you had to be sure to leave behind.
Oh, it's such a great question. One of the things that was really funny about the writing of the book is that, you know, as an academic and as a professor, I was telling my students, and I was writing in my own work, you write your thesis first. You define your terms. What are we talking about when we're talking about trauma? And then you make your argument for the rest of the, you know, book or the paper or whatever. And in this book, we needed to, and this happened in the editing process. I had written it like that, and my editor, who's amazing, was saying, this isn't working. We have to pull these things apart, because part of what you're doing in the book is leading up to the definition of the terms. A lot of what the book is doing is trying to redefine trauma, given the new science that we have. And so I couldn't do that on page one because we're not all on the same page. I need to go through the history of the study of trauma, the neuroscience that's involved, some of the psychology. Why do we need to rethink this? How can the reader see this in a client story versus just a theoretical framework? And then put the definition at the end of the book. So leaving that lesson behind of like how to structure an academic book versus a book for a trade audience was huge, difficult thing. And my editor was very patient with me, because I was like, well, I just think we need to abandon the project. It's just not going to work. If we can't define it in the beginning, we can't do it. That's how much it went against what I believed. The thing that I brought in that I think worked really well was discipline, because as an academic, there is an expectation that you are writing and publishing, and that's how you keep your job. And so I was very used to being in a very disciplined place with my writing, which I know is so hard for folks to get into. And so that I think worked really well. And also I had this practice of sort of front loading projects where I try to get as much as I possibly can in before it gets to an editor, whether that's an editor, you know, from my publisher, or a friend who's taking a look at it, you know, as a favor. I try to kind of front load the project, which I think helped a lot as well, because then you just have more pieces to work with.
Yeah. Another possible similarity or difference I can imagine is that you would reference that some of this book is made up of your own experiences, and some are made up of the experiences of people you've worked with. And
Yes.
so in both of those scenarios, I imagine that you need to be careful about maintaining confidentiality of the people you're talking
Yes.
about. What are the similarities and differences there between doing that in a memoir sort of scenario versus an academic scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually, I found it to be really similar. And I think there's probably a lot of different ways that you can do this when you're writing in a non-academic space. But I sort of took in the ethical framework from working with human research subjects from academia, into the work in this space, because I felt like that may be more rigorous, but that's okay. We'd want to err on that side rather than to be potentially, you know, giving up somebody's details in a way that would be, you know, problematic for them, because the audience is so much bigger. The thing about academic books is that they're so prohibitively priced, and they're so directed towards academics, that when you do have a mishap, if that does happen, that's of course an issue in terms of your ethical code. But this is a much wider audience. So I wanted to be really, really careful. Interestingly, one of the things that came up when I was pitching the book to publishers was I had written a couple of chapters as part of my proposal, and publishers didn't believe that they were composites because they felt like such coherent, unique, specific stories, which I thought was a really interesting way to sort of underscore the importance of understanding and talking in a much broader way about trauma, because there are a lot more similarities. Trauma sort of tricks us into thinking that we're isolated, that we're the only person who's been through this, that we have it worse than anybody else, and that no one could possibly understand. And when you look at these stories, which really truly are composites, you see, oh, wow, I have a lot in common with that person. And so I'm not alone.
Is the use of a composite, what drove that rather than using very specific individual case studies?
Just anonymity. I wanted to make sure that my clients were anonymous. And I also wanted to had a particular argument in mind. I wanted to make this argument that the trauma response is actually a sign of strength, not weakness or disorder, which the science absolutely proves out. But there were a couple of ways that I wanted to hit that. And in order to do that, it was easier to craft a composite that maybe hit 2 or 3 points than just look at one, have 15 chapters with different things trying to get, okay, remember this point. Now let's go back here. Let's expand on that. So it was kind of ease of the message, both for me writing it and also for the reader reading it, but also for anonymity of the client.
Well, it seems as if this idea of the points that you wanted to get across might be a good point to move from what you learned that you wanted to share with your fellow authors to what you learned that you wanted to share with your fellow readers.
Yeah.
So as you were working through this, what kind of lessons did you want to leave your readers with, and maybe what lessons did you yourself learn that you didn't expect in the writing of the book?
Yeah, it's funny when you set out to prove a lesson. I'm a teacher as well, and so you sometimes come into the teaching knowing that you have to do it, but not fully 100% believing it. You might know that it's right, but you can't really quite embody it. And so I think that when I was writing this, I knew without a doubt that the science behind this, and I knew without a doubt what the brain shows us. But I think in the writing it, I realized in a more embodied, personal way how true these messages really are. And the first one that I want the reader to come away with, which is right in the very first page of the book, is that you're not alone. Trauma and grief and loss trick us into thinking that we're alone in our pain, and that's not true. And so that was the first lesson. The second lesson that I wanted to get across is this idea that, because of the way that the history of the study of trauma has unfolded, we have sort of retained this idea that to be traumatized is to be broken. And what the science shows, what our biology reveals, is that the trauma response is adaptive, and we have it for a reason. It's there on purpose. It's what enables us to survive. And so behind it is this inherent human will to survive. It is not actually a sign of weakness or dysfunction or disorder. It's the opposite. That being said, when the trauma response gets kicked on, and this is kind of to the third lesson, we can get tricked into thinking that we are now powerless in front of our symptoms. The trauma continues to remain present and there's nothing we can do about it. The truth is that we have actually a lot more say over our nervous system's response than we think. We can't change those default set of responses, nor would we want to. But when those responses become maladaptive and get in the way of our daily lives, we do have a lot of say over that. And so each chapter of the book has 1 or 2 tools that the reader can use to actually start to recalibrate their nervous system and start to feel safe in the world as they're doing all this sort of narrative processing. And then I think the last lesson that I wanted to get across is this idea that we don't need huge, giant, good things in order to counterbalance the bad things we've been through. I think this is a societal message that we get a lot, that if you've had a lot of trauma, especially in early life, that you are traumatized forever. And that's not actually true. Really tiny, small things, beautiful relational moments with other people, the feelings of awe or wonder in the world, experiences that we have that are positive and make us feel safe can really rewire the brain and recalibrate the nervous system and sort of undo a lot of the quote unquote damage that the trauma did in the first place. And so I wanted to sort of expand this idea of healing from, this is not just about getting through and managing symptoms, but about being able to engage in the world in a completely different way.
It does seem as if you're in the place of dealing with trauma, then every little thing can set you off.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to find those happy things. Like I remember
Yes.
periods of my life where I was dealing with like some pretty big trauma and I was forging ahead, and then something tiny would happen. I'd stub my toe or something. And suddenly it was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and and all those bad feelings came out. But as you were saying, sometimes if you can recognize those small things, it can help pull you out of that. So just very briefly, can you give an example of how people can adjust their perception of what's going on around them so they can see those good things that might give them some help?
Yes, absolutely. One of the practices that I do in my day-to-day life as much as I possibly can, and also that is in the book, is called Tiny Little Joys. And the idea is that you because our minds are hardwired to imprint negative experiences because that's an evolutionary advantage, right? If you remember the things that are dangerous, you're more likely to survive. We have to manually imprint the positive experiences. And when we forget to do that, when we don't have a practice of that, the whole world can start looking really negative and can also start conforming to this worldview that you are under attack and everything is terrible and there's nothing good in the world. So you're trying to walk through grief or trauma and then you stub your toe. And instead of that being an isolated experience that is, of course, painful, it becomes a signifier that means this is more proof. The world is terrible. There's nothing here but pain. And that's a very natural pathway for our brains to go down. If you can develop this practice of tiny little joys, which is you imprint any tiny thing you can in the course of a day, shoot for once a day, but if you can get to 2 or 3 times a day, and I mean like drinking LaCroix is a thing that is pleasurable for me. And so that's a tiny little joy. This is cold, it tastes good, and I can savor that feeling of the bubbles on my tongue. That's a tiny little joy. We dismiss these things because we think they're not big enough to counter the negative stuff. But what we end up doing is actually rewiring our brain circuitry. And the more we focus on these things, the more we see them. And then our worldview starts to fill back out. Yes, of course, there is grief and trauma and loss. And at the same time, miraculously, there are these tiny, beautiful things that if we pay attention, never go away.
It does sound like a good advice, whether or not you're dealing with trauma or not. I think sometimes we
Right.
just get
Yes.
so wrapped up in the day-to-day that we overlook the fact that we're having a nice beverage that we enjoy and is cooling or refreshing or what have you.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and we get so tied up in, one of the things that the trauma response operates on the stress response system. So anything that is applicable for trauma is also going to be applicable for stress. So if you're feeling really stressed out and super overwhelmed, imprinting these things can also be helpful because they make you feel safe and more in control of your kind of surroundings. Yes, these things are going on, and at the same time, I just had a wonderful meal, or I had a wonderful conversation with a friend I haven't talked to in a long time, or saw something really funny on the internet and really had a belly laugh about it. Like these things, they matter and they do counter the other things. I say that from this place in my life where I discovered tiny little joys completely by accident during the darkest moments of my own life, where I thought I would absolutely drown in grief. And these things would just pop up in my perception, where it was like I would be crying on the floor and then all of a sudden I would hear a child laughing from across the street and it would make me laugh, and I would think, oh, okay, there's more to the world than just this grief that feels like it's going to drown me.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use the meal mention to thank you for
Yeah.
like a little appetizer of what you have to share in
Yes.
your book, because obviously we could talk about this endlessly, but we want to just give people a
Mhm.
little teaser of what you have to offer. So,
Yeah.
and I also wanted to mention, you and I talked about this a little bit before we started recording, that there was a podcast episode that I thought would be a great companion piece to this conversation. It was the Indie Author Podcast episode 168, How to Write from Trauma Without Re-Traumatizing Yourself, with Mary Adkins. And I thought that, as we were talking, I was thinking back to some of the things that Mary shared about her own experience and how she worked through that. And I think that would be a fun follow-on for people to experience after this conversation. So,
Yeah.
MC, thank you so much. Please let the viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and your book and everything you do online.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am on Instagram and TikTok at mc.phd, and my website is alchemycoaching.life, and you can find everything about me in those 3 places.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.